my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, which is James Walters, and he will be talking about Django development. Let's give him a hand.
All right. Hi there. I'm James Walters. First of all, thank you so much to all the PyOhio organizers and volunteers and sponsors for making this happen. Last year was my first PyOhio. I'm proudly sporting the PyOhio 23 shirt today. And I was thrilled to hear that this year was going to be an in-person event. So I absolutely wanted to be a part of it. This is my favorite Python conference, I think. I haven't been to a ton of them, but I just love being in a room full of local Pythonistas. I'm sort of local. I'm from Indiana, so thank you for having me. And for anyone who's joined us from afar, there's people from all over the place here. We're glad to have you as well. And thank you to you all for being here. It's not even noon, and you're taking on a talk about deployment, so you are courageous souls. Now, I want to preface this talk by bringing up Flask for just a moment, or Pyramid, or just about any other Python web framework. I'm a Django developer, and this is a talk about Django specifically, but I want to emphasize that a lot of the broader principles that we're talking about here will apply to other web frameworks as well. The things that we're talking about, when you get down to it, really apply to running a web app generally, including Python web apps through WSGI. And so while I can't comment on the precise way something might be done in Flask, if you're a Flask developer, or fill in the blank for Web2Py or whatever your framework is, you'll probably understand how you might apply this to your situation. So, but for the rest of this talk, I'm going to address Django specifically. So, let's talk about what Django deployment is really about. How many of you think that WSGI is something that you order at the bar? Okay, a few of you. How many of you think that a gun of corn is some sort of like ballistic horse? How many of you have never deployed a Django project before? Maybe you're a beginner, you've never deployed, or someone else does it at your org. Okay, quite a few of us in here. And now the question of the hour, is Django hard to deploy? I was looking over the 2023 Wagtail Developer Survey and found it noteworthy that about 23% of respondents, almost 1 in 4, said that there were not enough examples or documentation about deployment. And Wagtail is just one corner of the Django ecosystem. I think there's a talk on Wagtail here at the conference this weekend. So I think that this is clearly a place where a lot of people have a hard time. And hopefully we can simplify some of that today. Let me begin by telling you what we're not going to talk about. We're not going to talk about the penguin in the room today. I know one of the things a lot of people have trouble with when deploying Django projects is getting acquainted with Linux, but today we're going to limit our scope to just the stuff around running Django and maybe a web server. Your operating system is an implementation detail that is outside of our purview today. What we are going to do today, though, is boil deployment down to a handful of main concerns. Because the problem with deployment, I think, is that we teach people how to build apps. We focus on getting to know Django and using it to build out a project. And then when we get to the end of that, what often happens is we just give someone a deployment recipe or a list of steps to follow. And the problem with that is the steps that worked yesterday might not work today, or the provider you used might not work for me. Or if the recipe does work, maybe I got my app online, but I didn't really learn anything about deployment. And I don't understand any more than I did before about what's going on in the process. And there's a lot going on in the process. There's a lot of moving pieces to deployment. So I want to break down deployment into 4 main concerns that you need to think about when you're taking your app from your code editor to the web. The first is static files. Again, in the Wagtail survey, the #1 step of deployment developers struggled the most with was configuring static files and media files. Jacob Kaplan-Moss conceded that difficulty in his PyCon talk from a few years back called Assets in Django Without Losing Your Hair. Now, if you're a seasoned Django developer, I know what you're probably thinking, but static, right? I learned this on the first day. You use the static template tag to link to your static files, and Django figures out the rest, right? Well, we need to take a moment to explain what is going on with static files. These are assets like your images, your CSS style sheets, scripts. They're called static files because they aren't dynamically generated. That's almost sort of an anachronism at this point. We might call them like assets today, things like style assets. Most of your Django project's pages, though, are built with templates that get filled in with information by your program on demand when users request the page. But that never happens with images or CSS files. Those are just files sitting on disk, and they're ready to be served. So web servers like Apache or Nginx were built for the task of taking files on disk and serving them to users. This is where the web started. On the slide, we've got something like an old-fashioned Web 1.0 website where our user goes to yourwebsite.com, a static HTML file is fetched off the disk by your web server and is served to the user. But we have a Django application because many pages need to be generated on demand with data from the database. We don't have them sitting on disk. A web server can't do that. We need an application to generate those files. So where does that put our static files? Do we want Django to handle them? Since these files are not generated by your Django app, we actually don't want Django to handle these because your Django program will be way slower than the web server for this particular job. So we want the web server to do it. How Django actually deals with that is it stuffs all the static files into one directory, and this will be static root in your settings.py. And this makes it easy for the web server to just look and find the files that it needs to serve. And then we use the static template tag in our templates to tell Django that this request for this file needs to be passed along directly to the web server. Now, the reason that this might seem kind of new is because Django has been handling static files for you in development. The Django development server, manage.py run server, has to handle those requests because when you're developing locally, it's the only web server available. But when you deploy, you'll have a better web server than that at your disposal, and that server will be quite capable of handling static files on its own. So once you've set a static root to stuff your static files in, you can actually stuff them there by running manage.py collect static. And you'll have to do this anytime that you change any of your static files. Now, some of you might be thinking, if you're familiar with this, what about white noise? If you're not familiar with white noise, this is a middleware that you can add to Django that intercepts the request in the middle of the cycle. And if the request is for a static file, white noise will interrupt the rest of that slow request cycle and just serve up the static file immediately. It's a great option if you're in a situation where you can't directly configure your web server, like maybe your virtual machine is handled by your infrastructure team and you can only push code to it, something like that. Where white noise really excels is if you're serving your site from a CDN, or content delivery network. In that case, it's beneficial to add HTTP headers for things like caching and compression, and white noise takes care of all of that for you without having to think about it. Also, that cache busting that white noise can do for you is a lifesaver if you rely on any JavaScript running on the client side to do any important business logic for you. I work for a call center, and a colleague and I rebuilt our agent's knowledge-based web app for handling calls. And the app had to wire into our phone system through a JavaScript API. And there came a point where I needed to make some important changes to that code, but I couldn't afford to have people using outdated JS files from the browser cache. That would have rendered them unable to control the call. So I had to make sure that when that code deployed, it was requested fresh by everyone's browsers. And in order to do that, I needed to set up white noise with cache headers. So white noise really is a great way to solve all these problems. There's a reason that it's virtually the default choice at this point for the average Django developer. But if you're not using something like a platform as a service, It's also worth taking a look at writing the web server configuration yourself for at least a few reasons. First of all, writing an Nginx or Apache config isn't really that hard. Here's a link to a great real Python article showing you how to do it. Secondly, you made a web app. You should invest some time into understanding some of the fundamentals of how the underlying web infrastructure that supports your app works. After all, a lot of the confusion around deployment stems from this sort of impedance mismatch between the nuts and bolts of web servers and our higher level web app frameworks. And thirdly, I would suggest that you should learn how to solve this problem using something other than white noise, because it won't help you when you come to user uploaded files. So Django calls these media files. This is basically stuff that people other than you post on your site. So think profile pictures, file attachments, any of that kind of thing that people have an opportunity to upload to your site. Now, the way you set this up in Django is pretty similar to static files. Instead of static root and static URL, you'll use media root and media URL in your settings.py. And again, white noise won't help you here. White noise only deals with static files. So you'll need to know how to set up your deployment situation to find your store of user uploaded media files. If you're in production, what this most likely will look like is configuring a cloud storage backend like Amazon S3 for those files to go live in. But the main rule of thumb is you don't want to store those on the same machine that your app is running on. You don't really want to permit people to upload arbitrary data onto your production machine. That's just kind of not hygienic. So a little separation there is nice. Okay, so we've addressed static files as one of our deployment concerns that we have to think about solving somehow. The next one is our database. Some of you might be thinking, but SQLite, right? It's been doing great for me here in development. Why can't I use it in deployment? And that's a question that we'll leave for the database admins among us. Opinion is in fact starting to shift on this topic. It's possible to configure SQLite in ways that will scale quite far. I've linked to Tom Dyson's talk from DjangoCon Europe 2023 about using SQLite in production, where he makes a compelling case for this. Simon Willison is also using SQLite behind his dataset project. But the point that I want to talk about here is not so much which database you use, but that your database may well be different in deployment than it is in development, and that's something that you have to think about in this process. Generally, if you use some sort of cloud provider, you'll be connecting to a remote database that's managed for you, and that means you'll have a URL for the database, a port, username, password, this kind of stuff, and all of that will live in your settings.py. SQLite is really cool because it keeps everything in a single portable file, and that makes it easy to back up, easier to wrap your head around, and since you don't connect to it, you don't have to handle those connection details. Your settings.py is pretty simple, but if you're using a different database in deployment, you'll need to rework your database settings. And so here's a couple of examples straight from the Django docs. On the left is what your databases section of settings.py looks like when you run start project. So you just have the database engine, in this case SQLite 3, the database. But over on the right, you see an example of what this might look like if you set it up with Postgres. You have the database engine and name, but you also have the host and a port to connect with, as well as login credentials. Now, not only do you need to configure your new database, but you have to run your migrations as well. Sometimes people get their app stood up, and when they start trying to load pages, they get 500 errors. And it's because their database tables were never actually set up. So this is easy enough to handle. This is what your Django migrations are for, or this might be Alembic if you're using like SQL Alchemy and Flask. But you just run manage.py migrate while connected to your deployment database to run your migrations and set everything up. So again, we haven't gotten into the specifics of databases today. The point is just that your database situation in deployment will almost certainly be different, and you need to be ready to think about that in the deployment process. Okay, now let's talk about WSGI. what on earth is a WSGI server? This one is exciting because this is how your actual app runs in deployment. Now, some of you hear that, and you might be thinking, but run server, right? Isn't that how I run my Django app? In development, you've been using manage.py run server to run your app. But as the name of that would suggest, manage.py is just a management script. How do we run our Django app in a production environment? So you'll recall that we talked about having a web server like Nginx installed. And this is the piece of software that receives HTTP requests and returns HTTP responses. But we have Django apps to generate the web pages on demand. So how do we get these two things to work together? The web server usually just handles files off disk. How do we make it talk to another application? And the answer is WSGI. That stands for Web Server Gateway Interface. It's usually pronounced WSGI or whiskey. And the way that this works is when the web server gets a request, it passes it over to the WSGI server. And this would be like Gunnicorn or Waitress or uWSGI. You might have heard these names before. This is what they are. They're WSGI servers. That WSGI server runs a WSGI callable for your application. Now, how on earth do I make a WSGI callable, you ask? Django already did this for you on the first day. When you ran start project, it lives in the WSGI.py file. And so you set up your WSGI server and you tell it, whenever you get a request, run it through this app's WSGI callable, and then the WSGI server will run requests through your app, and after generating the appropriate page, it passes that response back to the web server to hand off to your user. So now to configure that, you'll need to consult the documentation of your chosen WSGI server, but again, the point here is not to tell you which one of those to pick, but that you had to pick one. All right, so we've configured our static files, we've thought about our database, we've planned out our WSGI server, and now we need to spend some time thinking about our web server. Or we might not need to worry about that at all. Let's discuss it. So concerning web servers, Apache and Nginx are going to be your two main options. Both are great. Configuring either of them is beyond our scope here, but if you don't know which to choose, Nginx tends to be more popular these days. It's threaded, so it tends to be more efficient. Apache's a venerable old warhorse, though, and it's a perfectly acceptable option. It ran much of the internet for the last 2 or 3 decades. So, for an example that kind of fits all the pieces together, RealPython has a great article that involves configuring a Django project to use Gunnicorn through Nginx. So this is Django, a WSGI server, a web server. Great tutorial applying a lot of what we've already talked about. But the question remains, do you actually need to configure the web server yourself? And the answer is, it depends on your deployment choice. You might be running your app on a bare metal server in your home lab or at your company's data center, but for most of us, most of the time, we're going to be deploying to the cloud, and the question will be VPS versus PaaS. So let's get on into what those things mean. VPS stands for Virtual Private Server, and this is a virtual machine running in the cloud. It's basically a rented computer. You can get these from lots of providers. A couple of examples are Linode or DigitalOcean. A virtual machine is just that. It's a virtual machine. So this is like setting up your own server, except the hardware is rented from a cloud provider. So it's a very manual setup process, and you have to configure the entire operating system. But the benefit of this is that if you go down this route, you'll understand all the layers that support your app. The disadvantage is you're responsible for everything about that server. So if it goes down, you have to reboot it. You have to rotate out log files before they fill up your disk. You have to understand and set security settings, stay on top of updates, etc. So the alternative to that is Platform as a Service, or PaaS. PaaS is kind of different. This is a service provided by organizations like Heroku or Python Anywhere, and basically the provider will abstract away the underlying computer and you just focus on your app. You get your code uploaded, provide some details about hooking up a database, static files, where the script to execute is, etc. And you don't have to worry about the servery stuff, like worrying about updates, rotating system logs, or understanding security settings. You also wouldn't have to configure a web server. The provider would handle that for you. So do we have a verdict between the two? PaaS usually costs a little bit more than a $5 VPS, but if you don't want to become a part-time system administrator, then it's easily worth it, especially for small projects. My personal favorite is Python Anywhere. I think they've done a good job at keeping the control panels in their UI focused on the details we've been talking about. You can see in the pictures here the configuration options for telling Python Anywhere where your static root is, where your WSGI callable lives. So it's a tool that helps you understand this process more rather than just papering over it like some services do. And they also have a free tier for those just getting started. Okay, so lastly, I'll just point out a couple of tools that are helpful in getting a grip on deployment. The first is Django's own built-in deployment checklist. This is a little tool that scans over your settings file and just tries to warn you about some things that might not be configured safely whenever you get deployed. For example, it'll warn you if debug is set to true. That would leak some important information about your app. To use it, you just run manage.py check tick tick deploy, and let me show you an example of the sort of thing that you will get from it. I know this might be a bit hard to read, maybe not so much in a smaller room like this, but you don't have to read it word for word. I just kind of want to give you an impression of the output that it generates. I ran this on just an out-of-the-box, fresh project, and these are some of the things that it pointed out. First, there's a couple of HTTPS-related settings there. Django expects you to be encrypted when you're running in production. Then we have a warning about my secret key, which needs to be stronger. We have a couple of settings about secure cookies that it wants us to set. Second from the last line there, we have debug is set to true. And finally, it's letting me know I should configure allowed hosts. So that's a smattering of the sort of stuff that it catches. Go and spin up one of your projects and try it out, see what it tells you. All right, talk on Django deployment really wouldn't be complete without mentioning Django Simple Deploy. This is from Eric Mathis, who wrote the wonderful Python Crash Course book from No Starch Press, if you know that. And it came out of a need to future-proof the Django section of that very book against the ever-shifting sands of PaaS providers. So it basically tries to automate the deployment process for some of these platforms and help get your app online. Obviously, this is great for newcomers, not only because they just finished their project and this helps you get it online expediently, but also because if you have Git, then you can diff all the changes that it made to your code in order to get an idea of the sorts of things that you need to change to configure your app for deployment. It's not just targeted at newcomers, though. Eric kind of envisions this being useful to people who want to experiment with different cloud providers, or as well as to those cloud providers themselves. So very cool project. You should check it out. Currently, fly.io, platform.sh, and Heroku are supported, and I think more might be planned, so watch this space. And then finally, I want to mention a very relevant project called Django Production. This is from Peter Baumgartner over at Leak and Loop. This project seeks to add sane defaults for a lot of the problems that you face in deployment. So the point that he raised was that if Django's philosophy as a web framework is to include batteries that solve the most common problems that web developers face, why doesn't Django include any batteries for deployment? So he made one. And some highlights of what it actually does for you are, it installs white noise to handle static files. It installs a package called Django Environ for reading environment variables, which is something we haven't touched on today, but is often a factor in getting deployed. It installs a package to allow you to run your web server from manage.py. That's pretty cool. It defaults to Gunicorn, which might not be a great choice if you're developing on Windows, so maybe look into like WSL if you go this route. It'll add a health checkpoint, which is important for integrating into system monitoring if you're using that. And it will add stuff to your settings.py file for all of these things, just right out of the gate. So this ticks a couple of the boxes that we've talked about today. It handles static files, handles the WSGI server pieces for you, and that's sort of half the battle right there. So this project is worth looking at as well. All right, now before we wrap up, I want to say a couple of things about the whale in the room. Is there anyone in here that does not know what Docker is? All right, well, a lot of us are pretty familiar with this at this point. You kind of can't, be a developer without tripping over Docker at some point. Docker is a really popular deployment choice for all kinds of software, and for good reason. You basically stick your app inside of a Docker container, and you can avoid a lot of the common pitfalls and streamline the deployment process. But it comes with some pitfalls of its own, so let's just discuss that briefly. The first big advantage that you get out of running a Docker container is that you isolate the application environments. I know that Will Vincent is a big fan of this for development. And this means that you're always using the same Python version, the same Django version. There's no more spooky action at a distance, no more, well, it works on my machine, because you're passing around not only the code, but the environment that it runs in. Everything here is a lot more consistent and reproducible. This also means that it's really easy to deploy multiple apps on the same machine. So if that's something that you need to do, you can deploy multiple apps on one machine without Docker, but that starts to get really messy. It's much nicer when all the apps just live in their own little box and can't really touch each other. That keeps your underlying server really nice and clean. And it's worth mentioning that some of the platform as a service options are doing exactly this. They'll take your code and bundle it up inside a Docker container. The second advantage that you get is the deployment process gets condensed down to a Docker run command or a Docker compose up command. You get to wire up the application and the database and the web server in configuration files or scripts, and then you just run them. So that's got a strong appeal. There's a lot of folks that like that. But there are some drawbacks to this, and really it just boils down to added complexity. Docker is now another thing that you have to understand and wrap your head around. And although it can be fairly straightforward once you've learned it, it adds a lot of complexity for the beginner that you really may not need to bring onto your plate right now. It can be confusing to understand how do you run commands from inside your Docker container, or how do you wire up containers to talk to each other. And containers are ephemeral by default. So if you want to save your data, you've got to learn about Docker volumes, right? This starts to pile on kind of quickly. Michael Kennedy recently said on a podcast commenting about deployment that if he were dealing with a total beginner, he would just show them how to deploy from scratch on Linux. And I agree. Docker is just Linux, but it's Linux. So if you know how to do it on Linux, you'll be able to do it in a Docker container. But if not, then you won't. Which brings me to my next point, which is you still have to understand everything that we've already talked about. Docker does not give you a shortcut here. You still have to deal with static files, your database, your WSGI server, and probably your web server as well. You've just added the abstraction that these things no longer run on your computer, but they run inside tiny slices of your computer. And the advantage to that is that the slices are mostly consistent and mostly keep to themselves, and you can start the slices with a single command, and that's nice, but it doesn't abstract away the essentials that we've talked about today. And that wraps us up. So there's lots of things that we could talk about. Should you deploy with a serverless function? Which database is the best database? These are all great next steps to consider. But at a bare minimum, I hope that I've shown that these four major concerns, static files, database, WSGI server, and web server, are the places to begin when figuring out how to deploy your Django application, or any Python web application for that matter. If you can get your head wrapped around these things, you'll be able to get your app online and make it to hello world. The rest are details that you'll pick up as you continue to develop and get comfortable putting your work online. So that's the end of my time. I'll hang out here for a bit, though, if you want to come ask me a question. So thank you.